Hey everybody, my name is Joe Pivarunas. I'm the founder and managing editor of Nanalyze. We're a boutique media and research firm that covers disruptive tech investing for a broad audience of retail and institutional investors across the globe. Today we're going to talk about a company called Okta. They were hacked recently, and we've asked the question here, will they recover? Now, if you're an investor in Okta or if you're familiar with the company, then you've probably already caught wind of what happened. If you're not, Okta is a cybersecurity firm with some tremendous growth, and we've written about them in the past, I think in November of last year. I'll link to that article in the description of this video. And we made a bull case for the company, mainly their strong revenue growth, the SaaS business model, the fact that they're a leader in what they do. You can see the magic quadrant here. Okta and a company that they acquired, the two yellow highlights there, are leaders in what they do, and they're competing against Microsoft, and that becomes very relevant in today's video. Now, we're going to talk about the fact that Okta had a bit of a crisis this past week, and it involves cybersecurity. Now, we've covered cybercrime a fair amount over the years. This is actually a picture I took in the hallway of the Group IB office in Moscow several years ago, and they're one of the most elite cybercrime fighting units on this planet, and they have a war room and everything. It's really quite interesting. They were in the process of moving to Singapore, which was, in hindsight, a very smart decision to make. Now, we talked a lot with them about cybercrime, and should really read this piece. It'll be in the description of the video. Talks about some interesting cases with North Korean hackers trying to emulate Russians, and it's just really fascinating stuff. It's like a spy novel. Now, hacking used to be quite a noble cause back in the day where you did a lot of things for street cred, but today, around 90% of all cyber crimes involve money theft. So there's a real reason why smart people, especially those who may be in, let's say, economies that aren't faring so well, are tempted to go to the dark side. Now, some of those people, about 5 days ago, started posting screenshots on Twitter and various other places showing access to internal systems at Okta. And you can see one of the screenshots here. There's Jira. That's a tool that IT people use to track tickets. You've got Salesforce. You've got all these different internal systems that this group was showing they could access. Now, this was not a good look for Okta because just a month ago, they were here saying, Microsoft acted too late on a major security threat, right? One of their competitors. Well, now they're in a real situation because they're the ones in the news, and there have been varying responses to this. And I think what's important is that we get into what actually happened. Now, before that, the company certainly didn't do a good job of handling the problem. So this was a tweet that the CEO had sent out. You shouldn't let your CEO use Twitter unless he's Elon Musk. That man says things with conviction. This here messaging is something that seems to be vetted by the legal team. So there's this avoidance of responsibility. He says, we believe, and that's not a good thing to say, the screenshots shared online are connected to a January event that they already know about. And he says, based on our investigation, no evidence of ongoing malicious activity. Well, what about the time between January and now? Is there malicious activity that, there's just begs too many questions. And of course, it got absolutely destroyed on Twitter by all the armchair cybersecurity experts. Now, their CSO released this timeline about 24 hours after those screenshots were released. Interestingly enough, I used to work in the same firm as this gentleman. He was a security officer in a financial services firm I worked at. So he's had plenty of experience working in the financial sector where you need to be tight as a drum when it comes to security. And then he went to Symantec and spent, I think, 3 years there. And now he's at Okta. He's been there for about 2 years. Put together this nice timeline, and it starts on January 20th. And this is when Okta Security received an alert that a new factor was added to an employee account. The target didn't accept an MFA challenge. So basically speaking, you have an employee account that's trying to add a new method of authentication, and that process failed. arising some suspicion. So you can see here they investigated the incident and escalated it, and then they disabled this individual's account, and the account was at a third party provider of services, so a vendor for Okta called Cytel. I don't know how that would be pronounced. We'll say Cytel. And Cytel informed Okta, this was in January, just the day after this took place, that they had a leading forensic firm, outside support, coming in to analyze the event. And then a lot of time passed. And then in March, so this would have been 10 days ago, Okta received a summary report about this incident from Cytel. Very interesting that just 5 days after that, those screenshots were shared. And then, of course, Okta Security determined that the screenshots were related to this January incident. And then the same day, Okta receives the complete investigation report. Of course they did, because heads were rolling. So the CSO published this timeline. You can read it on the website, and there's quite a few takeaways from this. We'll pause for a second so that everybody can try to understand the dilemma of security in firms like this. So, the security officer wants to tighten everything up so much that nobody can do anything. And there's always this tension between security and usability. So what could this compromised account actually do? So the account was compromised from January 16th until January 20th. So if we go back to this timeline, we see that when that was picked up and the account access was turned off, that the perpetrator had access for 5 days. What could they do during those 5 days? Now, Okta had gone through every account that Cytel had used to do anything during that period of time and had a look to see what exactly happened. They went through 125,000 logs. So they should be able to see everything that took place. That's just because in systems like that, there are event logs that automatically write down things that people do. Well, what could they do? Well, they could access Okta's instances, as we said earlier, of Jira, Slack, Splunk, RingCentral, support tickets in Salesforce. So you could see that not client, relationships in Salesforce or other things, but support tickets. That's pretty typical for a support function. And then this internally built application, most organizations have applications like this, used to perform basic management functions for Okta customers. What they couldn't do was create or delete users, download customer databases, access source code repositories, or obtain account passwords, though they could help facilitate the reset of passwords. So that's what the person could actually do that got into that machine with access for 5 days. So what was the impact? That's most important. How did this impact anyone? Well, Okta said it impacted about 2.5% of their clients, so 365 clients. In terms of how it impacted them, they were subject to access by this particular account. And there was a letter on LinkedIn from one of Okta's clients berating them, of course, as you would expect, an open letter that had a lot of attention, talking about how this individual wasn't happy about how they handled it. It wasn't the fact they got breached, it's that they knew that back in January and they didn't say anything. Well, we're going to talk about that a little bit later. First of all, the legal team decides what direction things take. So, but what it looks like in that timeline was that they didn't seem to think there was a reason to alert clients because they didn't even have the report back from the third party. So what we're most interested in, and it's clear that some people dropped the ball when you look at that timeline, there's no sense of urgency whatsoever. We're more interested in knowing what's the root cause of this problem and will it happen again? And what had actually happened was that a hacking group had gotten a hold of a person at that support company and connected to their machine using what's called a remote desktop connection so that they would be able to act as if that person left their machine and that they were logged in and do anything that that person could do. And of course, they were limited by the functions that a third-party support engineer can perform, which if Okta had any sense, would have been significantly limited. And we have to trust that, in fact, this support engineer at a third party couldn't do very much. So for 5 days, this hacking group could get onto this machine and using this remote desktop connection. Now, what's more interesting about this story is that this particular hacking group, there's an excellent article. We did a research piece that accompanies this video, and there's links to the articles that we're going to reference. And one of them talks about, it's from Krebs on security. It talks about how this hacking group worked, and it's remarkable. So they would go on offering like $20,000 a week to employees at AT&T or Verizon or T-Mobile for inside jobs. So they would go around paying, and that's a lot of money. So if you're working for $10,000 a year at a call center in Manila, like the support teams that I used to work with, if you can work for a month and make, 8 times your annual salary, that's going to be pretty tempting. And guess what? You get in trouble a little bit locally, you know the right people, you got some friends, you're not going to have any problems. You maybe have to pay a little bit of that money to somebody, perhaps, but you're never going to face a jury. So that's very compelling for companies that have their customer support centers outsourced to emerging markets. So it's not even just third parties, it's also when you're operating in emerging markets, you really need to pay attention to what's going on with your employees, because an offer like this is very compelling. And the team that was doing all this stuff had about $14 million in Bitcoin they made from extorting other companies, and they were using that to further their cause. The interesting thing about this is the hacking group Lapsus, they just arrested 7 people, the London police did, between the ages of 16 and 21 in connection to this exploitation. I guess they've released them pending investigation. Turns out the kid leading the group is a 16-year-old from Oxford with autism who has $14 million in Bitcoin. And it's funny, they interviewed his dad and he's like, yeah, he just, we thought he was playing a lot of video games. And his kid is just tearing things up. The group is said to have possible connections in South America. The third party Citel, based out of Miami, seems to have some connections with South America. So there's an element of internationalism here. It turns out that cybersecurity researchers like those at Group IB that we met with have been tracking this kid for nearly a year. So hopefully now that will stop. And if you investigate this, we spent a lot of time looking at this and reading articles and feedback. And this group was actually making a lot of comments in response to the ones being made by Okta, and they just looked really mature and attention seeking. So I think a takeaway there is that whilst they may be, technically sophisticated, they probably weren't trying to do anything too malicious. And a security advisor had compared this to SolarWinds. And if you look at the sophistication of what happened with SolarWinds and you look at this event, they're really apples to oranges. At least that's how we see it. Now, there's some questions that need to be answered if you're an Okta shareholder. And I think that these are probably some of the questions being raised. Could this have been prevented? Well, they say there's 2 types of companies, those that have been hacked and those that will be hacked. So it probably couldn't have prevented, but it could have been handled better for sure. And what's the root cause? Well, it's probably having a third party access internal systems. If that wasn't the case, then this would have never happened. The financial services firm that I spent a decade at working with customer support functions all the time, we kept all our support in-house. It's just too sensitive to have third parties do customer support. So I would just question, and others say, well, you can't get away from it. Everybody does it. Well, maybe they should be questioning that, certainly questioning the access and why a third party, because when you have a third party, you can't control the security. They'll tell you one thing and do another. So the root cause is really the fact that they had a third party that didn't have sufficient security in place. And should they have had a third party doing customer support in the first place? What's the worst that could have happened? Well, it doesn't seem like much, and we'll talk about the bear case shortly here, what's about the worst case scenario, but we just don't see that. And then the effectiveness of their own solution, it's not lost on people that Zero trust would have solved the problem. Zero trust is all about never knowing who's on the other end of that keyboard. Somebody can walk away from their laptop, somebody else can come by and start using it. Well, how do you tell it's somebody else? Well, perhaps the way they wake up their mouse. We all do that differently. The way that you type your name, the way that you type in general. Sophisticated zero trust systems will pick up on that. So the fact that didn't happen here is quite interesting. The ability of the company to handle a crisis internally clearly shot to hell. So you can look at that timeline and see there was no sense of urgency, and there should have been. Letting a vendor sit on a report for months. This whole thing is ridiculous, and probably stems from the fact that they didn't think it was a big problem to begin with. And the people who condemn them for not saying something sooner should remember that they didn't know. It doesn't appear that they knew the gravity of the situation until they received that report back. They should have pushed that vendor to receive that port in days, not months. And then lastly, will clients forgive and forget? Well, people forget very quickly. The 97.5% of clients that weren't affected by this will certainly forget very soon. The ones that they tell, they share the information, listen, you were affected, they're going to use that when it comes to negotiating contracts. So this will potentially could have some short-term fallout, as long as the company is being honest and transparent. That's very important, right? If we have to trust the management team. If we didn't, why would we hold shares of this stock? We have to trust that what the management team is telling us is correct, and that's that depends on how you view that. But at what point do you say, well, I don't trust management? Well, I don't think that so far that anybody's been led to believe that management shouldn't be trusted. Now, the bear case for this, there's an article by Cyberscoop. It says Okta breach leads to questions on disclosure, reliance, and third-party vendors. Certainly does. This gentleman at a cybersecurity company, Phobos Group, called the Okta hack potentially SolarWinds 2.0. Well, go read about SolarWinds. It's crazy. It's spectacular how sophisticated that was, and compare what happened at SolarWinds to what happened here. So it doesn't seem that you can compare those two events. This gentleman also questions Okta's assertion that the attackers were gone in 5 days. Well, again, you're going to have to trust what the company tells us. They have access logs to everything that everybody was doing. They included in the scope of their investigation every single action that was taken during those 5 days by the suspected account and by every account at that vendor. So you need to take that into consideration. And then this individual talks about how these attacks on Microsoft, NVIDIA, and Samsung, they were all attacked. This was all in the news by the same group, could have been made possible by the Okta breach. Well, doesn't seem to be the case. You would think that these firms would have been able to deduce that in doing their own investigations. The fact that this group was acting last year, even prior to the Okta breach, would lead us to believe that they had these capabilities and that they were executing them independent of the Okta breach. And then, of course, this individual goes on to say that the 400 customers, the 365, who were told that they could be affected, have probably started these feverish internal incident response campaigns. They probably have. So he says the chances are non-zero that other companies will come forward and say they got into us too because they used Okta. And when that news breaks, it will be pandemonium. Indeed. But these are all speculations, and that remains to be seen. So what Okta needs to do, most importantly, as a $20 billion firm with over 14,000 clients, is they need to go out to anyone paying them meaningful money. I think this is about 2,444 customers paying them more than 100K, and make sure that these customers, are content or reassured, whatever it takes. Usually they get the salespeople on the phone, and when events happen like this, it's all hands on deck and everybody's out there calling customers, and there's meetings and all that stuff. And it's pretty standard stuff. What everyone needs to remember is that the legal teams dictate what gets said. So that's just how that's how these firms operate. So what you're being told was vetted by legal, vetted by everybody that mattered. And that's the messaging, and we're left to see if there's any fallout. But, from our perspective and what we've looked at in the research piece that accompanies this video, it appears that this is a temporary problem. We have no reason to believe otherwise, that this is a temporary problem that Okta will get through. Their share price is getting beat down. That's great if you're a buyer of the stock. Question is, does this present any sort of systemic risk to the company, similar to the SolarWinds analogy used earlier? We don't believe it does. We believe this is a temporary setback. They'll have to fight some fires over the next few months. Spend a lot of time assuring their key customers this doesn't represent systemic risk. And in the meantime, we don't believe there's any reason that the firm won't be able to recover from this temporary setback. So it's possibly a buying opportunity for anybody that wants to be long this firm. So love to hear your questions, comments, opposing thoughts. Please put them in the comments section. We'll respond to them there. I'll put links to the articles referenced in this video in the description. Make sure you subscribe to our channel. Thanks so much for taking the time to join us today.